Okay, so we are now recording. This is the Polymath podcast, or just Polymath podcast. I'm with Shane McMullen, and I am Patrick Compton. I should just to give like a brief introduction of who I am, and I'll let Shane introduce himself as well. I am an independent researcher. I specialize in psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy. Not specialize, but that's what I mostly research on my own now. And I'm also a musician. Shane, do you want to say anything about yourself?
Yeah, I am have a bachelor's degree in psychology, and I been working on mental health and developing proper communication skills and promoting self-development for a decade now. And I have had close experience with people suffering from mental illness and substance abuse. Gonna try to get a master's degree.
Yeah, I'm in college currently to try to get some kind of a degree in neuropsychology, hopefully a master's and possibly a PhD eventually. But right now, college is extremely expensive, so I'll just take what I can get on the government's dollar. So we were just, like Shane was saying, we both have experience with people with a myriad of psychological disorders and just people that struggle with communication. I mean, pretty much everyone seems to nowadays, and we're both just very much in the mode of trying to help people see things from a wider perspective, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So we were looking at what is it, maladaptive traits, or let's see.
Unhelpful thinking styles.
Yeah. Yeah, let me bring this up really quick.
Yeah, they're behaviors of cognition, or I guess cognitive behaviors, or they're not even behaviors, but they're ways of thinking that are maladaptive into balance and stable awareness. And yeah, they basically mental traps that everybody seems to fall into when we're not mindful and aware of what we're thinking about or how we're thinking. For example, everyone's familiar with black or white thinking, and that comes to seeing things either this or that at one extreme or another rather than the gray area between. And it can really lead to a lot of painful thoughts about the world, that everything's either us or them or against us. We definitely see that in the political climate.
Yeah, especially today. Today, we're recording this today is the day that Russia decided to invade Ukraine and started throwing bombs at them.
Yeah,
It's
the
caused a
us
lot of
or them
political turmoil.
mentality.
Yeah, and it's a lack of wanting to pursue diplomacy versus just black and white thinking.
Right. Yeah, and grandstanding, promoting your political agenda rather than working with people to create more harmonious international diplomacy. I mean, we see these behaviors in people all the time in our family, especially our parents. I hear my parents saying, "Well, I'm not perfect, so I can't say it in the perfect way. I can't do things perfect." And it's not about trying to be perfect. That's what they call all or nothing thinking. Like, unless you can do it all, it's not worth trying. And I can also compare this to when people say everything gives you cancer. Well, that doesn't mean don't try to minimize your risk with antioxidants. You should still at least make an attempt to prevent it, not just give up on trying.
Yeah, I like this term that Lex Friedman uses called leaning into life. Like, it's not all about conquering life and like going whole hog into everything you do, but at least just being in a state of forward motion with life.
Right. And leaning in, being flexible so that if things don't go the way you'd planned, you can roll with the punches and adapt. I think that's a big part of life is adapting, because when we get stuck in the way we want things to go, we always get disappointed,
And we're
usually get
evolution.
disappointed.
Yeah, we're a good distinction there. Yeah, we're evolutionarily an adaptive creature. Like this is something I actually came to learn recently. It's very interesting. It's not just that the the vaginal opening allows for our heads to only grow to a certain size. I'm getting somewhere with this. All right. It's a
I guess a preface.
So it's also the idea that nature set us up to be very slow learners that adapt to our environments based on our ecological system, based on the environment that we inhabit. So we do have very large brains, but they could only develop to such a size in the womb. The rest of it is up to us to learn in development. That's why we're crawling on our knees for months after being born, as opposed to like a horse who just gets up and starts running around. We're constantly adaptive. Like, our brains are set up to always be adapting to the environment that we're in. And that continues through adulthood, that continues up through youth and into adulthood. I'll bring this image up on the screen. Unhelpful thinking styles. What we're seeing here in this diagram is just a list of, well, they use the term unhelpful thinking instead of unhealthy thinking, and that's a good distinction, I think. When I was learning cognitive behavioral therapy, they used that word unhelpful a lot, and I think it's good. I think it's good to like think of it in that context.
I agree, and I think it's synonymous with maladaptive. Maladaptive isn't saying it's going to hurt you, it's saying it's not good at adaptation, which is what we need to prevent suffering. If we aren't adapting, then we're just going to get steamrolled because we're not changing with the times. And so maladaptive or unhelpful is something that is not helping you reach your full potential, something that's not benefiting you and your future endeavors.
Yeah, it's not promoting your self-esteem and your eventual self-actualization. So yeah, the first thing they list is that black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, or what you could also know as absolutism.
Or, I'll get into an argument with my father and he'll be like, well, if you're not going to listen, then, why are we even talking? Well, just because I don't agree with you, or he'll say, well, if we're not going to agree, what's the point in talking? And it's like, we don't have to agree. It's about opening and exploring and teasing out the information so that we can make a more informed decision and have better discussion.
Yes, this is at the bottom of the idea of a dialectic versus a debate. We're not trying to win an argument, we're trying to reach some form of mutual understanding in a dialectic.
Right. See both points of view so that we can have a more balanced opinion.
It's just the problem of the ego that gets beat up with it. Our ego is so attached to our ideas because that is who we are, and it's hard to shift away and like expand upon who we are.
For sure. And this all or nothing or us and them thinking also falls under the compartmentalization that you've mentioned before about how evolutionarily we had to adapt to, identify danger or safety. And then we learn that there are only two categories, safe and dangerous, or, good and
And
bad.
and
And
not
then
sure.
we haven't evolved. And what's that?
There's safe, dangerous, and not sure, like left to be determined, and that not sure zone should be much wider.
But then not sure probably falls evolutionarily, it would fall in the danger zone. Things that we don't understand is often the things we're afraid of.
Yeah, potential threat. Yeah, compartmentalization is also like that. Also lines up with entropy and like the actual physics of the brain. It requires less energy to go to make an assumption based on things that we already know or think we know. Like it literally requires less effort.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so you can see how even today, all or nothing thinking can break down complex issues. Even, you can mention the coronavirus or, racial equality, critical race theory. So many of these controversial topics are people only see two sides, this one or that one, where there's a whole lot in between that people are too afraid to discuss because they're afraid of betraying or not doing their virtue signaling. You know, it's a shame that we
Yeah.
can't open up the gray area and explore it.
Yeah, or people just don't have time to do their own research. And what's the quote? It's like everybody's an expert in virology now. I think that's hilarious.
Yeah, everyone thinks they know the truth. And I think it comes down, you said you were watching a video about charisma and body language. I mean, I really think it comes down to how people are so sure of themselves. And, you can think something and not be sure that this is the answer. Leaving, even in the way that we speak on if I'm telling you about something, the way we're speaking, it's with rhetoric. We're saying this is the way it is. But what we mean is this is the way we've found it to be based on our experience. We're not
Exactly.
experts. We don't know the way things work, but this is what we think and believe. And I think it's important to, even just now, as I'm saying, I think it's important. Like, this is what I think, not what I know to be true. And that
Yeah.
distinction, by saying I think or I believe or this is what I've come to understand, we're leaving some room for being wrong. We're leaving it to where there may be an aspect we're not considering. So that open-mindedness, open space, I think is really important for a discussion.
Yeah, exactly, man. That's really good that you came to recognize that. I mean, I've been living in this headspace for the past few years now, but I used to be very much in the former category of just compartmentalizing everything and thinking in black and white thinking and acting upon that black and white thinking. And it takes a while to get into the mode of like not being completely attached to your ideas, but once you get into that mode, it opens a whole new world to you. Like as cheesy as it sounds, it really is a much better way for at least for me to go about integrating with my reality.
There's multiple angles, multiple perspectives to every issue, and the more perspectives we can see, the more fleshed out our arguments will be. And that's why I often play the devil's advocate, is because people are so sure that this is the way it is, and I'm like, well, what about this? What about this circumstance? And I'm not talking about the tiny little situations where, there's exceptions to everything, but I'm just saying, like, there are other ways of looking at things that people aren't our reflex. It's not the initial thought. We go for the easiest thought first. But if we really think about it, we can see that it's not that simple most of the time.
Yeah, we're in a search for truth. We don't know what the truth is on most things. And I was actually talking about this with a Sunday school teacher. He was trying to take a scientific approach on the Bible, and there was a lot of use of the word like this is the truth, or just coming to the conclusion that this is the true way to look at things. And I try to emphasize the idea that the idea is to be in a consistent search for truth. That's what at least what science is about unbiased thinking and leaving theories open as theories until something better comes along, and then we improve the theory. Like the theory of evolution is still left open as a theory of evolution until a better theory comes along, because we're in a consistent pursuit for truth. But yeah, so we're looking at the next category is overgeneralization. Uh, Everything, yeah. So this is also kind of absolutism. The examples it gives are everything is always rubbish, nothing good ever happens, and it's crazy how many people I talk to online that use these words. So I mean, it's most of the people that I talk to in regular life as well seem to use this, especially when it comes to politics.
And even as we've talked, we can hear these words coming up: always, never, especially when it's come to you always and you never.
Yeah,
When it's personal, it seems like that's more absolutism. Like, it's always this way, and it's never always. That's you never say never, like, it's never always one way. There's always fluctuations and flexibility in the things, in everything everyone says. I mean, humans are contradictory by nature. They're inconsistent. They make irrational choices. And so try to, and when people say these things, they don't actually mean always. But I think it's important for us to be clear with our speech and for us to be accurate in that nothing is always something, you know, leaving, like, that's what I was talking about before, leaving that space for being wrong or for there being something else that's not considered, you know.
totally. Yeah, man, you very much value clear speech. I respect that.
Absolutely. Our communication isn't just important for communicating to other people, but also the way we form our thoughts in our minds, the way we communicate with our own mind.
Yeah, so this the next one is mental filters. So it says only paying attention to certain types of evidence and noticing our failures but not seeing our successes. So Noam Chomsky got into this way back in the day when he coined the terms what is it, self-anchoring bias and confirmation bias, and this kind of touches on that notion. Like we are drawn towards like things that already confirm what we already know, and so that leads us to paying attention to more of those kinds of sources of evidence.
Right. And it's referring to having a filter that only allows you to see things from one side. If you do notice your failures only, then you're not seeing the other side of the coin. And I mean, there's the duality in most things. I mean, and that's the spectrum, the black to white and then the gray in between. And when people only pay attention to one side of that, they're more limiting, more, stopping themselves from seeing what could possibly be contrary to what they assume. They're making assumptions.
So the next one is disqualifying the positive, or discounting the good things that have happened or that you have done for some reason or another. Things like saying that doesn't count.
Counting the good things, yeah. I mean, I would say that I've definitely fell victim to that where, I think part of it comes from how critical your parents were or your teachers or your authority figures growing up. Because, my dad said that his mother would do the same thing to him, where he would get all A's and one B, and then of course they're gonna point out the B and try to fix that rather than praising you for all the A's you got. And he did the same to me, and he's expressed extreme regret for the way he did that because it's caused me to be hypercritical. I was hypercritical of my parents for the way that they raised me, hypercritical of my friends, myself. And when I am so hard on everybody and myself, it diminishes the good. It diminishes, the things that we're doing that may be unintentional, but are, you know, everyone makes mistakes and people aren't perfect. So we should allow ourselves that grace to where the bad doesn't outweigh the good.
Yeah, it can be easy to see things as mostly negative too, because it seems like it's so easy to slip into depression. I mean, the world that we're living in now is very different than it was 20 years ago, and especially 50 years ago. We're so overstimulated by things that like are drawing us to wanting to be fulfilled or seeking like these temporary forms of fulfillment, and then that can make us. It pretty much like throws us off like our center of balance on what's a balanced normal uh, way to, or a balanced sense of homeostasis in reality, that gets off kilter. And it's also like Brian Keating, or this astrophysicist Brian Keating talks about how there's more ways to be disappointed or more like ways to experience pain than pleasure in reality. He gives the example of like you can only ride so many jet skis, or you can only ride behind so many boats on skis and things like that. But there's like there's more and more ways to feel pain or feel like disappointment and things like that. Which I mean, I think there's some truth to that, but I mean, there's also another way to look at that. Like there's boundless gratitude to be had through looking at different fields of study or looking at life through different angles.
Right, right. The idea that there are more ways to, no, I feel like that's more perspective based. If you can find beauty in every little thing, as you've expressed, you can walk down the street and notice the asphalt and how much time took to build these roads and the parks and the trees that were planted. I mean, you can find beauty anywhere. I think that
Exactly.
when what was it? The disqualifying the positive. Uh,
Yeah, that's just that. Yeah.
I think that my theory of why we focus on the negative more than the positive, and the way it was described to me, I think, in a TED talk, was that our society has oriented us towards fixing and correcting and being critical to where, from the moment you're raised, that you're, well, not the moment you're born, but when you're being raised, you are told good boy, bad boy, and you're taught to put qualifiers on your behavior and everything you say and do. And that can lead us to the point where we look at things through these generalizations or these judgments. And that, so in the TED talk, they said, think of something you don't like about yourself. And usually people can instantly think of something very quickly. But then they would say, think of someone you really admire. And that takes a bit longer. It's harder to think because society doesn't have us oriented towards that. We're not
Yeah.
used the cascades of action
Yeah.
potentials haven't primed the area of our brain that allows us to think of positive things quickly.
You're talking about neural cascades. That's what Andrew Huberman talks about a lot, and Lisa Feldman Barrett as well. I mean, that comes from our default mode network. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we established our default.
Establish a default that's oriented towards noticing the good. But after all the criticism that got from my parents, every little thing that I did wrong being pointed out, it's normal for me that to be my default. what's wrong with this picture? And I've also always been oriented towards critical thinking and problem solving in school. So when I look at something, I think, what's wrong with this? I edit the grammar. The first thing I see is, what's wrong with it? And that's so
Yeah,
sad
yeah.
because I want to see the beauty first. And now I've trained myself to say something positive. Is that anytime someone shows me something, no, say something positive first. Then, if I want to offer constructive criticism, I'd say, "Oh, would you like to hear my ideas of improving this?" And if they're not interested, then I don't tell them. But I can
Yeah.
definitely leave my positive thing there, as the main hallmark.
Yeah, you're really good about that too, man. You use that technique a lot in our or in our normal conversations as well on the phone.
I appreciate that.
What are you talking about with like the way that well, it's Western culture versus Eastern. A lot of Western philosophy and Western education styles aim us towards this critical thinking thing or a solution based mindset. And solution based mindsets can be really useful, but when you apply that the humanities, or essentially, it gets a little tricky. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be too, pervasive. The Eastern philosophies, they tend to be more towards gratitude, being happy with where you are, being satisfied with anything, any conditions you can find peace in. And whereas that can lead you to complacency, it can also lead you to gratitude. And so I think blending the two, where, you're happy with where you are, but you also make steps towards make improving and getting to further along. But it's about the journey, not the destination. So there's no specific place I mean, you can set goals and meet those goals, but you're never finished. So it's not about accomplishments, it's about the journey of self-development and improving, and then looking back and see how far you've come and be grateful for that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of Western education and also theocracy talks about just good versus evil, and we don't have to get into this really deeply, but we'll touch on this more. This idea of good, it's like Socrates said, it's not that it's good versus evil, it's wisdom versus ignorance, and a lot of Eastern philosophies tend to emphasize that notion, which that just eliminates the black and white thinking. Like it lets you see that when you apply it to people, most people are ignorant of what they're doing. They're not actually evil and trying to get you. Like they're not psychopathic or not trying to like plan out how they're going to screw you over or anything. It's mostly accidental.
Yeah, or yeah, ignorance, not knowing the effect that they have on other people and their
Yeah.
words and actions. And it even said in something I really admired from the Bible, John said, I know what I must do and I know what I should do. So why can I not do the things I know I should do? And why do I continue to do the things that I know I should not do?
Totally. It is unfortunate that the Bible does emphasize a lot of the good versus evil with the whole God versus Satan metaphors, but it also has this golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Treat your neighbor as you'd want to be treated. And that's something that we don't need to keep out of school. Like that's a very simple rule that we could be teaching through elementary school, middle school, up through college. I mean, I don't
I
see why
think
we're
that
not
I
doing
was
that.
taught that in elementary school. Um,
But it has to be continuously taught, like, yeah, because a lot of times when we're kids we say no. Like when I was a kid, I didn't listen to my parents at all. I was always thinking that I knew best, and that was the case with education as well. So when you hear it from different sources, it kind of starts to click for a lot of people, I think. Yeah, it says mind reading and fortune telling, so imagining that we know what others are thinking and predicting the future based on little evidence, I would say.
so there are two types of jumping to conclusions. One is mind reading,
Yeah.
imagining what we know others are thinking. So that's when you think oh, they're judging me in this way, or they think that I'm some kind of screw up because I've been screwing up, or because I took a break, they now think that I'm lazy. Well, it's first of all, it's impossible to know what other people are thinking unless you ask them. And it's none of your business what other people think of you. It's their business. And if they feel comfortable sharing that with you, then that's their choice. But you have no right or privilege to know what other people think of you.
Yeah. All you can do is ask to confirm.
It can be very maladaptive. Exactly. It's so, never make assumptions because you can't know what people think. But the other type is of jumping to conclusions is fortune telling, future, where that's more assumptions. You think you know what's going to happen or how people are going to behave. That's what I just mentioned earlier. Like you can think that, oh, they're going to be ungrateful if I do this for them, and then they surprise you. They recognize their gratitude because a lot of times people are so caught up in their life and what's going on in their own head and all the obligations and thoughts and guilts, and then they don't even see that they're not being grateful. And it also, there's been scientific evidence, studies that have been shown in psychology that family, when you do something for a family member, a lot of times we think that the thanks is implied, that the gratitude is implied because of course I'm grateful, you're my family. But it actually, it's been shown that it hurts people when you don't say it.
It happens a lot with only children. Like parents will endlessly just give kids whatever they want, and
Spoil them.
yeah, they're spoiled,
Why
and
not
then kids
spoil the
just
children?
yeah, they just don't end up expressing gratitude.
It doesn't come naturally for people. Like pouring out gratitude, like, it's such a wonderful feeling. I
Yeah,
wish
I mean,
everyone could have that.
well, that's part of the goal of this podcast is to instill that natural gratitude. We talk about it like universal gratitude.
There's so much to be grateful for and so much love. And like the other goal of this podcast is to help people. Like we want so badly to help you, to help the people that don't know what to do, who feel lost and stuck and trapped. And we want to help people escape the mental blocks that are holding you back. We have so
Yeah,
much compassion for the suffering of every human being, and no one's suffering is more or less important than anyone else's. And if there's even a little bit that we could do to relieve some of that suffering, it's worth doing all this work.
exactly. Yeah, man. I mean, that's part of what this unhelpful thinking styles is all about. Which the next category is like we were talking about catastrophizing, magnifying and minimizing things, or just blowing things out of proportion. It says it can be inappropriately shrinking something to make it seem less important. That's I mean that's absolutism in a nutshell. And like what was it? Qui-Gon Jinn said, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes."
I definitely see a lot of catastrophizing with people who are very caught up in their emotions. uh, Things, my mom has borderline personality disorder, and especially in that, but even people without that disorder, it's like everything is the end of the world. Everything is a dramatic, why is everything happening to me? And this is going to throw my whole day off. And now my day is ruined
Yeah,
because of
now
this
my
one
day is
incident. And,
ruined.
things aren't the end of the world. There's almost nothing that humans can't handle. We're very resilient and we can overcome anything with proper training, coping mechanisms. And then it also talks about minimization, which I think minimizing, if I understand it correctly, minimizing people's feelings. So,
Yeah.
if someone said, "Oh, well, you really hurt me when you said that," and then they say, "Oh, it's no big deal. Why are you making a big deal out of this?" That's minimizing someone's feelings. Like, it doesn't matter how insignificant it may seem to you, even if it is insignificant, it still made someone feel that way. And I feel like we should have some kind of, you know, like we should feel for their feelings.
Yeah, you use that word valid, and that's really important in psychology as well. Like it's important to validate people's feelings. Those feelings may be unwarranted, but the fact that you're feeling them is a very real thing, and that should be addressed.
Right. Even if it's insignificant, it's
Yeah,
still
man.
important.
Speaking of that, the next category is emotional reasoning. The it says assuming that because we feel a certain way, what we think must be true. I feel embarrassed, so I must be an idiot. Cognitive behavioral therapy talks about like the books that I read about that. They give entire lists of all these in categories. Like I feel this, so I must be that. A lot of these are based in if-then statements. Like if I am not perfect, then I will not be accepted in society.
Right.
Things like that.
Right. And yeah, if I, can't have a good job, then I'm not really succeeding. Or just assuming that things are true based on something subjective. So the
Yeah.
feelings are not facts. That's one of the things that dialectic behavioral therapy teaches, that it is not just about how, you may feel like a failure, but you're not a failure. You may feel like, you know, you're not succeeding in the world, or you may feel alone, but you're not alone. So the way you feel doesn't determine the way things actually are in reality. It's just temporary. And so in DBT, they talk about letting the feelings wash over you like a wave and then letting them pass and
Yeah.
letting them go, that they're temporary. And, even in the Buddhist
Yeah, I was
philosophy,
gonna say
that
Buddhism
pain,
talks about that. Yeah.
yeah, that pain and suffering are both temporary, that no pain lasts forever. And that's what I tell myself, at times. But then no pleasure lasts forever. You go to a concert, was the example that was given in Buddhism class when I was in college. When you go to a concert, it will end. The concert will not last forever. And so you enjoy, by staying mindful, you enjoy that time, you remember it, you savor it. But then when it's gone, you keep the memories and cherish them, but you don't latch on or try to stay stuck in the past. You move on to the next positive pleasure
Yeah. You
that
live in
will
the
come.
moment.
And then,
Yeah, it's like in Buddhism they talk about oneness and being here now. Well, that's what Eckhart Tolle talked about. Like you are one with everyone in every moment. Now this I write about this. There's a dichotomy here that has to be examined philosophically. The idea that we want to live in the moment, we want to be here now, but we are a planning future based entity as well. Like we have the ability to plan, and we also have to set aside time to make plans for our future. Like we have to set aside time to work on projects or work on things that are going to benefit us in the future. And so bringing ourselves into that moment, like that's still bringing yourself into the moment of planning and looking, like extrapolating and thinking forward. Some neuroscientists actually are bold enough to call this time travel, and we are indeed the only creature that can time travel in our minds, if you will. We can see into the past and see into the future, or we can imagine into the future and we can reflect on the past. And that's a really beneficial quality of being human that we should respect and use responsibly. Like don't dwell on the future and don't dwell on the past or the past. But yeah.
precognition, we can see the effects of our actions. I think that's one of the things that separates us most as higher level thinkers, is that we can predict what will happen. If I do this, these will be the consequences. And people with impulse control issues, they cannot see the consequences as easily, and therefore they are surprised when there are consequences. And that almost makes you a slave to your own mind, where you do what you feel like doing, and then you don't feel any connection or responsibility for what happens as a result. And then you're just being swept away by the whims of your own mind. And I think it's very important to maintain that agency, as you like to say, with over what we choose to do and accepting the consequences of it. And then if we do make a mistake despite analyzing, or if we forget to uh, pre-think, pre-plan, then we make amends for those mistakes.
Yeah, these next three categories are actually really critical. The shoulds versus musts. Shane and I have been friends for a long time now, over something like 6 or 7 years, I would say, and we've become very close friends. And there's this idea that I've heard a few psychologists talk about, that they say that friends shouldn't use the word should with each other, and they shouldn't play each other's therapist. And we have cognitively decided to make a kind of an unspoken pact that we are going to try to be therapist for each other and try to, like, not so much call out each other's flaws, but like point out when there's room for improvement in each other. And I personally have seen where that we both seen where this can reach a breaking point, and where that's a real risk to be taken in friendships. But there is use in that. But there's a lot of risk with using these words like should and you must do this, and telling people they should be like this. Even yourself, like telling yourself I should be this way to achieve this status. Yeah.
In terms of saying, they say don't should on yourself. I think that's to say that don't judge yourself based on what you think or what society tells you you should be. Now, when it comes to shoulding other people, like you were talking about friendship, I think the implication that arises is when I say you should do this, it makes it seem like I know better than you. I know
Yeah.
what's best for your life. And it's impossible for someone to know what's better for somebody else and what someone else is capable of. So when you say should, it takes away mercy. It doesn't allow for you should work. I mean, it would be helpful to you to work on this. It
Yeah.
would
Just
be
like that.
beneficial to you, and that's the way it would be most helpful to say it. But saying you should do this puts obligation on them and they feel like a failure because they're not fulfilling your expectations of them. And my dad has drilled into my head that expectations are what lead to suffering, that the higher expectations, the lower your acceptance level and the more disappointed you're going to feel. But the lower your expectations, the higher your acceptance level, the more you will accept the way things are, that you can't change other people, places, or things.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that more with the idea of the zones of control, or the locus of control, which we're gonna look at later. Yeah, this next, trying to get through this category here. The next category is labeling, and this is a huge concept that we talk about very often. I mean, labeling is so sticky of a concept. Like we love to absorb labels, and we love to like hold them as banisters essentially. I mean that's the whole point of credentials. Like I am Dr. Patrick. I'm not Dr. Patrick Compton, but that is what I would put at the beginning of my title, because that is a label that identifies me as this certain status. And if I want to say like I have depression or I have anxiety, this gets pretty complicated, but that is a very easy to absorb label that people can hold. It's internalized, and they wholly embody it, and it can be something that can very much work against you, because it's like you've caught the depression. Like I have this unhealable thing that cannot be addressed, and it gets used as an excuse. Like if I can say that so boldly, it gets used as an excuse for a lot of situations.
Yes, I've definitely noticed that even in high school, people would label themselves as OCD or depressed or, what have you. And I think that that's very limiting. That when you limit yourself to one word, it's like that's all you are. Even the labels we put on our own personalities, it's like you are more than one label. You are more than a goth or a jock or
Yeah.
whatever. Like that puts you in a compartment and there's no room or space to grow or to branch out to see someone as a multifaceted person with multiple labels. I mean, and the labels themselves, they're used for identification purposes only. And so that if you say you're you know, I mean, I think polymath is too vague, but if you call yourself an academic, then I can recognize that label to see you're an academic. Now, does that mean that you don't also like non-academic things like comedy or sports? No, but by putting that label, I can then identify you as, oh, you're interested in academic things.
Yeah, that's why I have the. I also have, in addition to like the philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience sections of my YouTube channel, I also have a music and comedy section, because that to me is what like the best way to go about being a polymath versus a monomath in life is like. But there's definitely major dangers in the major danger in psychology today. The like personality psychology, like the big five ocean traits of psychology, like open mindedness, conscientiousness, extroversion, apprehensiveness. Like you're apprehensive about things, and then there's neurotic, like which leads into nihilism, and that can be like. I mean, it gets really complicated. Like there's self-aggrandized narcissist, and like that's a very all these are very useful terms, and they can even be useful to put people into these categories temporarily. But to say that that's the entirety of their being, and that's the entirety of like that's where they're coming from, that can be very very limiting. And that's like where we're at the latest top-notch psychology, is we're still using these labels like this. Again, it has a lot of utility. There's a lot of use in what the DSM-5 is doing. Like the DSM-5, a Diagnostic Statistics Manual for Psychology, is what is like 500 page book that's basically full of diagnoses and labels that have a lot of utility in diagnosis, but not so much in with the patient. Like we have to be very careful when we diagnose patients and what we leave
Yeah,
them
and what
with.
you were saying about how people will put themselves, I have depression. Well, do you have depression now, temporarily, or
Or are
like
you
you
just
said, is it
sad
an
right
incurable
now?
disease? Right, right. And that's what I say, I don't like it when people call themselves OCD. You may have OCD-like tendencies, but the DSM criteria has very strict, and you have to have like 5 out of 7 or a certain number of these traits to be the full diagnosis. So you may have OCD symptoms or tendencies, but it's wrong to the people who actually have the disease to say that you have it. And,
Yeah, like for
I,
in my case, like I do have. I mean, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. As the umbrella term, the actual term is body focused repetitive behavior, BFRBs, of lip biting and cheek biting that would go beyond my ability to cognitively control it. So it would compromise my social interactions and things like that. And I was diagnosed with central language processing disorder, which is now known as central auditory processing disorder. And for years, I accepted those as labels. I accepted that as something that is has as power over me and that I could do nothing about. And only over the last like 4 or 5 years have I really addressed these issues and have conquered my body focused repetitive behavior and my communication, my central language processing disorder, to the point that I can do what I'm doing now with my voice, which is not the case. When I was 19 years old, I literally spent an entire year doing nothing but mumbling because I was so absorbed in this label. So we have to be very, very careful about these things. And I'm going to talk about this in a lot more detail on this channel as well. Because
yeah,
my own experience has
it's an
been very
amazing,
strange with this.
yeah, it's an amazing story that you overcame a lot of these limiting things and you didn't let the labels define you. You broke free of the labels and now you cope with these obstacles that are still affecting you and still probably, affecting you, but you're not letting them hold you back. And that's awesome.
These disorders, there in psychology, the terms are exogenous versus endogenous, and that's also kind of a gray area. But the idea with endogenous is it is from inside you. It is a genetically based thing that you are set up with, and the way that you interact with your environment plays into that. Like it affects how you interact with your environment, and it also affects how your environment affects you. With OCD and with my own personal OCD, I assumed that that was very much genetically influenced, but it also could very much be exogenously influenced from how I watched my parents. Like my mom also has the problem of biting her lips when she gets nervous. So I assume that in childhood I probably picked up that behavioral trait as well. I
So it would
address these
be
things.
endogenous, exogenous.
It would be both. I mean, I would say that this the strength of the issue and my inability to deal with it leads me to believe it's more genetically influenced or more endogenous. But yeah, I can see where I could also have picked that up from watching other people. With central language processing disorder, that's also like that's really hard to tell where that came from because language is so complicated. Like it's developed very early on in childhood, and so working back through that, like working back through the issues where you can see where that set in is almost impossible with that. But that doesn't mean it's impossible not to address these issues.
All right, the locus of control still resides within you. You have control over how you cope with it, at least, if even if you don't have direct control over the behaviors themselves.
Totally. So yeah, this last category is personalization. Saying things like "This is my fault," blaming yourself or taking responsibility for something that wasn't completely your fault. Conversely, blaming other people.
Right.
So yeah, that's putting yourself too
Yeah.
much into the
Oh,
picture or personalizing it.
I have so much to say on this one. Basically, a lot of people feel like the fault needs to be placed on somebody, that there must be someone at fault if anything goes wrong. It has to be someone's fault. And a lot of times it isn't someone's fault. It's circumstance, it's the situation, it's people make assumptions, and a lot of times it's multiple people's fault or nobody's fault. But laying blame on someone is not going to solve it from happening again. It will still happen again until everyone takes responsibility for their contribution. So when something goes wrong, you can say, here's my part. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I shouldn't have come at them so hard, or I should have been more listening. And so saying that everything is someone else's fault is something because people there everyone's ego is so fragile. We are constantly trying to defend and put up walls and be defensive against someone coming at us or hurting our ego. And so if it's as if people think that by admitting that they made a mistake, that they are a mistake. People define themselves
Yeah.
by their mistakes. And that's so sad because we are so much more than our mistakes. We are not all that we do or say or think. Who we are is so much deeper. And so for me, I don't mind if I make a mistake, while I may get a little defensive depending on how it's brought to me. If someone says, well, you did that, blah, 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 then I'm going to get defensive just for their tone. But admitting that I made a mistake doesn't hurt me very much. I'm happy to work on my mistakes. I want to know what I'm doing wrong so that I can improve. And that's probably from my parents or my dad instilling that to, fix my problems. And so you tell me I made a mistake, the first thing that I try to do, and sometimes I'm more successful than others based upon my energy levels and my awareness, but I say, "Oh, I'm so sorry about that. I'm sorry that you feel that way. I'm sorry that it came across that way. Like it's nothing for me to apologize. And I genuinely am sorry that I caused someone else pain, whether it was intentional or not. A lot of times people say, it's not my fault. I didn't realize. I didn't mean to. Well, it doesn't really matter about the intention. I mean, it does matter. The intention matters based on you weren't being malicious, which, I can appreciate. But the fact is that someone was still hurt. And so whether I intended to hurt you or not doesn't really matter. The fact that you felt hurt is the important thing. And so for me to admit that I made a mistake, one of my favorite things that I learned in the class of interpersonal relationships is reconciliation. There are three major steps to reconciling when you hurt someone. It's taking responsibility and admitting that you were wrong, apologizing, and then reconciling and or assuring them that it will not happen again or that you will work on that behavior so that it doesn't happen again. And one of the things that I've found is that when you bring up something that someone did right away, it's kind of like you're jumping on it. That isn't going to be as received as if you wait until you notice a pattern. If it keeps happening, that's when I'd say it's appropriate to bring it up with them if they're receptive. Hopefully, people will always be receptive. And then you can determine whether, uh, I mean, you don't need to determine whether it's someone's fault, but you can acknowledge what happened, see the miscommunication, and then work on making it, not letting it happen again. And in that case, you know, being your fault, so what? I made a mistake. I'll be better next time, and then you can move on. You don't have to beat yourself up about it. Everyone's trying to protect their fragile egos from having rocks thrown at their glass house, and it's like being making mistakes. That's what makes us human. You don't have to feel guilty. You don't have to be afraid to
Yeah.
apologize. But so many, especially men, from what I've noticed, is grown men, my dad included, is that, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Well, that's expressing a little bit of regret, but that's not really an apology. An apology is, I'm sorry that I did do that. Whether I meant to or not, I shouldn't have, or it
Yeah.
was a mistake. And so it's very important that we take responsibility for our downfalls. And if you take responsibility, then people won't feel the need to show you that it's your fault, just take the dog's nose and stick his nose in it. You don't have
Yeah.
to force things when people own up. And that's when I find myself trying to get people to see where they were wrong is because they're trying to weasel out or trying to deny any contribution to the negativity. And so if people just take responsibility, then there won't be need to be fault finding, you know.
Yeah, totally. This
Does that make
I mean,
sense?
you see a lot of this kind of stuff at work, and I mean, people are very stressed out in the workplace, and so because of that, we have to give them that much more grace and understanding. So when they go to cast blame on people instead of finding solutions, this is usually coming from a place of solution finding in the wrong way, or just being in the wrong mindset and just being in a very fast paced mindset. So we were talking about the zones of control here, and I wanted to look at this diagram here as well, called a healthy understanding of control. And Shane just shared this with me earlier. I think this is a really good way of looking at this.
Yeah.
It shows like a swinging pendulum between exaggerated, extroverted, and active maladaptive traits, and collapsed, introverted, and passive maladaptive traits. And we can kind of swing between those two. This is something that Epictetus brought up and examined in 500 BC, so 2,500 years ago. The ancient Greek philosopher, was sitting in a Grecian prison and came up with this philosophy of the zones of control. And he wrote the book called The Enchiridion, which actually is referenced in Adventure Time in season 2 of all things. And this is a very powerful concept. This is something that I myself have embodied, and I go to this part of my brain when I'm in situations at work that I don't have any control over, that I just have to suck it up and do it. I'm just reminded of like this. There's only so much I can do about the situation, so I might as well enjoy it, or at least get the best out of it, and start thinking about something more productive while I'm doing this mundane task.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most valuable pieces. Well, I guess first let's discuss this image. So it says that in the middle it has the pendulum at healthy, dynamic, adaptive balance. So when you're balanced and it's in the middle where it's supposed to be, is that you don't think things are too much out of control or too much in your control. You accept the things that are and let go of the things that aren't. But when the healthy dynamic locus goes too far to one extreme, again, the black and white, then it goes to the left, then it will be exaggerated, extroverted, active, to where you have the irrational belief that too much of life is within your control.
I'm sure there's people that you can think of like at work that think that way, like everything must be under my control, especially in management. Like, it's not all up to you. Like, you're part of the team.
Right, exactly. And that controlling type of personality is very difficult because they get frustrated when things don't go their way. And they're quick
Hmm.
to point out when they think something should be different. And that has something to do with having a filter on just because you think it should be better doesn't mean you have to say something.
That's something I definitely have struggled with, is especially with essential language processing. Like, there's extra filters that I feel like I have to go through, and not saying exactly what comes to mind, especially when you're in solution based mindset, like, and getting into the empathy things that we were talking about before. Like, when we want to empathize or sympathize with people, we have to give those caveats, like you were saying first. Just say, hey, I'm sorry you feel that way. Maybe there's another way of looking at it, instead of just saying, hey, here's the thing to do to fix it.
Yeah, yeah, there has to be a transition or a lead in. But yeah, then the other side is the too little control where you feel like nothing is in your control and that the whole world is chaos and you have no control over it, no place, no say, no voice in the way that the world works. And that's very defeating. I think of, when they are teaching a dog to obey its master, they will lay on top of the dog so that it can't move until and it'll struggle until it gives up. It basically, what do they call it? It loses its will, and so I feel like that can is what can be a result of going to this extreme is you have no control over anything. So you're just a will-o-wisp being blown by the wind and it takes you where it wants.
Yeah, that's irrational belief.
Right, right. Because we do have control over what we think, what we do, and our behavior. And but we don't have control over what other people think about us because that's none of our business. And you can't control people. And it's taken me years of trying to accept that I can't control people because I try to help them. And if they don't want to help themselves, especially with substance abuse, then there's nothing you can do. They have to be the ones to make the decision. You can only help them help themselves. And that's the same thing they teach in psychology. You aren't fixing people. You aren't giving them advice to fix them. You are giving them advice to help them fix themselves.
Yeah, all these are, or this concept of irrational beliefs is talked about deeply in cognitive behavioral therapy as well, and as well as in rational emotive behavioral therapy. I mean, it's rational beliefs or rationally examining your emotions and your attachment to them.
And once you get to the point where you can accept that you can't control other people, all you have to worry about is yourself. And that's way less of an emotional and energetic burden than trying to take the responsibility of other people's actions on yourself.
Yeah, a lot of the a lot of the problems that we face when we reflect or ruminate on the bad decisions that others make, especially after we've warned them, or if we didn't warn them enough, a lot of that comes down to neurochemical means. Like when we reflect on these things, a lot of that's us trying to figure out just what we could do better in the future, and a lot of that's based on self-defense of the ego. Like a lot of that comes back to a very natural response. So because we have that response, we can feel less guilty for having that kind of mindset. Like that's a very genetically based response to these things, if that makes sense. It's a very like deep seated response that seems to go very far back in our genetics is rumination, like thinking about how we could have done better on this thing or how we can do better in the future. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this comes to also solidifying our place in the tribe. That's something I wanted to talk about earlier as well. When we overanalyze just what we could have done better in a situation, that's also a genetic self-preservation mechanism that we have deeply seated in us, because that results in our status being solid in the tribe. And you can see how that would have a lot of emphasis 10,000 years ago, when if you happen to have a certain mental disorder that caused you to say weird things in the tribe, you would be excommunicated. You would be rejected from the tribe, and that would be threatening to your life. That's still very much with us. At least that's what I've come to believe and what the evidence seems to suggest. So we don't have to feel bad about that, but we know, like, because we know that that's how that works, we don't have to feel bad about having that as a natural reaction. But that also means that we can still work on that. We're aware of the mechanisms at play there, and we can counter them with our own cognition.
Yeah, we have a lot more power than we think we do.
Yeah, it's pretty. That whole notion of like your willpower is very much underplayed still, except for in the self-help field, which is all about thinking your way out of everything, which is very that's very complicated and can get you into a lot of trouble. But we have so much power over our own neurochemistry, like the habits that we formed with our default mode network. We can go against those. We can abrasively reject those habits. It just takes practice. Like the first day that we try to stop smoking, obviously that's going to be hard. The first day that we try to like start waking up on a better schedule, that's not going to be easy. But if you continuously tell yourself it, like with the whole self-talk idea, that that can lead you to some good places. That can really have a lot of power. And I've been getting a lot out of that recently. Like coming back to this idea of leaning into life, like that's given me more agency. That's given me more volitional control over what I do with my day, and recognizing when I'm going too far with watching Netflix or something, like binge watching, like just being mindful of when this is all right. That's enough relaxation. It's time to work on my own project. But you get into like I study mindfulness, or it's just self awareness, whatever you want to call it, and I write a lot about this, and I plan on talking about this more in my YouTube channel. Just being aware of where your goals are lined up, being aware of what you want to do with yourself, what your projects and overall goals in life are, keeping that in mind can keep you out of binge watching things. Like you can come to just be checking in on yourself every like 3 to 5 minutes or so, and when you get into a habit of that, in when you're indulging or just relaxing or whatever, you can be tempted to binge watch and continuously do these things. But if you're mindful, or if you've been practicing mindfulness, you can catch yourself and you can say, all right, that's enough of watching this. It's time for me to get back to doing what I was doing.
Yeah, self-regulation and discipline is
Yeah.
definitely important to for productivity.
and just generally having having control over your own life, in my opinion.
Yeah, 3 to 5 minutes seems a little often, but yeah, I think it's important to check in with yourself. And
Well, I give those numbers because that's what it's come to me naturally as like that's around the times when I'm checking in on myself more deeply.
it seems like a little too much. Like, oh, you doing right? Like shining a spotlight. Like, what are you doing? Like, it opens up for judgment of oneself. Like, oh, you're wasting time. Bad. So like, it doesn't have to be that cut and
Right. It's
dry.
well, it's not the it's not the like putting a label to it, like saying this is me wasting time. It's more like, all right, this is the 30 minutes or so that I'm going to be relaxing, and I'm going to be, or like an hour that I'm going to be eating and relaxing, and my intention is to enjoy the efforts that went into this comedy show, and I'm going to get the most out of it by staying mindful and absorbing the entirety of this content. But of course, not overanalyzing it from a videographer perspective or a cinematographer. Like, oh, that's a really cool camera angle they got there, or like the actor is not acting correctly. Like, you can take it too far with that. You know.
Why do you think that that can be maladaptive or unhelpful?
Yeah, the example I give is going to the movies with your friends versus just watching something on Netflix. Because if you're at home alone watching something on Netflix, it's going to prompt you for it's going to automatically start loading the next video, and it'll like require you to pick up your controller and put forth effort to intervene on that to stop it. Versus there's an obvious conclusion to the movie, and you go and do something else with your friends that you're more fully engaged in.
Right. And I think, like
And
you,
that takes no
what I was
effort.
asking is, why is it bad to notice or not bad? Why is it maladaptive to notice the camera angles and all the
Oh
little?
yeah,
And that's the thing. I think that that is a major behavior or thought process that can happen is when you overanalyze, you intellectualize, that can diminish the experience and it can take away. If you pick things apart, then the whole, amalgamation of the movie becomes little individual pieces, and that takes away from the experience. Yeah.
yeah. I went through a phase of that when I was first learning about cinematography and recording video, and I did the same thing when I started writing music electronically in Ableton Live. Like I'd listened for the types of effects and the types of compressors they were using, and that would distract me a bit. But I didn't really put forth a lot of effort to change that. Like I just naturally kind of got out of that. I think because that's kind of what the brain gravitates toward. Yeah, like I didn't have to change back to that. Like it was natural for me to just go back to enjoying the movie for being a movie.
Yeah, well, I've also seen, even as we discuss these complex psychological topics, I think that when you intellectualize, especially emotions and feelings, it takes away from their impact and can trivialize
Yeah,
them to make them seem like just facts and figures rather than, real emotional feelings that people experience.
that's kind of why I've been withholding on the neuroscience in this discussion. But there are examples where you can see how we were talking about before, where it's like the idea that this is deeply seated in our evolutionary neuroscience means that we don't have to feel so bad about it happening. And I can give you all the fancy words in neuroscience to help you understand that deeply, but that's kind of where it has its use.
Totally.
Totally.
So
So
I
I
wanted
wanted
to
to
look
look
at
at
one
one
more
more
thing
thing
that
that
you
you
shared
shared
with
with
me,
me.
the
The
cycles
cycles
of
of
change.
change.
Cycles of change, that's one of my favorites.
Yeah, buddy, you just shared that with me recently, and this idea of the upward spiral that we go through with these changes, that reminded me of what John Vervaeke talks about, or what the Bible talks about. It's called anagogia or anagogic, which means rising up and trying to achieve an enlightened state and reaching up towards God and with God. I think there's two ways of looking at that, but that's called anagogic or anagogic state, and it's very useful to think of it like that. Like that kind of goes back to leaning into life. Like we're trying to. Yeah, the term is ever onward and upward. I love that term, and that's the idea of anagogia.
I love this diagram because it is what I learned in psychology when they talk about making changes in your life. And so we can start at the beginning at pre-contemplation, which is you have no intention on integrating any behavior or changing anything. You just are your normal status quo. And then when you get to contemplation, you're going to change to be made, you're aware that maybe this is becoming a problem, or maybe this isn't the healthiest thing for me. It's consideration and contemplation. But then when you move on to preparation, you acknowledge that there's a change to be made, and then you make a plan. Um, what does it say? Intent on taking action to address the problem. So you start planning on how you're going to make a change. You set a date to quit smoking, or you set a date to start your diet. And so you're preparing for what it's going to entail. And that's when a lot of times people can that's one of the places where people can talk their way out of change because they start to think how they're going to feel after they start to make the change. And the fear of how you're going to feel is almost always worse than the way it actually is.
Exactly.
The fear gets expanded into what we think could be the worst possible way we could be feeling when it might not be that bad. And you don't know until you try.
And we
So
catastrophize.
then when you get to the action stage, you make active modifications of your behavior. You actually start to implementation of these changes, and you start to cut back, well, I guess preparation would be the cutting back, and the action is when you start the change and make the change. And then the hardest one, the one that I highlight every time, and that was highlighted to me, is the maintenance stage, when you have to sustain the change and as it replaces the old. So what is it? It takes 3 weeks to break a habit or make a new
Yeah.
habit.
So
Oh, I
we were
know
talking
you
about
want to
this
talk about
recently.
Sam Harris, right?
Oh no, it's Andrew Huberman on his podcast, the Huberman Lab. They did some major or what is it called? A major long scale study. Yeah, where they had a lot of participants over a very long period of time, and so there's a lot of accuracy between this, and it was replicated as well. So they discovered that the average period for people to make permanent changes, whether it's addictive behaviors or any kind of like new behaviors that they're trying to implement, takes from anywhere between 18 to 266 days. So for
More
me,
than three
it's
weeks.
yeah, way more than 3 weeks, and so that idea of 3 weeks is not exactly accurate for everyone, which is true for like medicine and prescriptions and everything. Everybody's very different in their neurochemistry and their ability to make permanent changes. So knowing that, like, we have to know that we could be up against a lot, and we have to listen to our bodies and know what our limits are.
That's such a wide range of days that, I
Hmm.
mean, that seems silly to have such a wide expanse. I mean, you could pretty much just say, well, change can happen some point. We don't know when it happens, but one of these days it'll.
Well, it's no more than 3/4 or 2/3 of a year, I guess would be the number. So it won't take you more than 2 years, 2/3 of a year to continue the behavior to have it permanently set in. And what we're talking about here is deeply changing your neuroplasticity, deeply changing your default mode network, the things that you default to, or the thoughts and behavioral patterns that you default to most naturally.
Yeah, the maintenance stage is definitely the hardest one. It's maintaining the changes that you've made, and this is where the relapse can happen or begin to start because as you get comfortable, so after a couple weeks, you start to get comfortable where with your new change, you start to get less anxious and more at ease with the change that you made, but the thoughts are still there. The
Yeah.
temptation is still there in those first few weeks, and things are going to call at you and pull at you. And the maintenance is the resistance of those temptations, which is the hardest part. You can make, once you get into once you make the change, one could say that the momentum can help you keep that change. But if you don't
Yeah.
keep that momentum up, then you're going to drop back down. And so you got to keep pushing and stay invigorated and don't lose sight of your goals because once you take your eyes off the prize, you get distracted and tempted, and then you fall backwards and start all over. And that's when the
Yeah.
next circle comes in, which is relapse. You fall back into the old patterns because if you don't stay vigilant and aware of those creeping thoughts, then, and again, the thoughts you have, you shouldn't dismiss them. If you're having temptations, examine that. Why am I feeling tempted right now? What is the trigger that's tempting me? Is it that something bad happens and I automatically run towards an escape and I want to escape the
Exactly.
feelings? Well, what would happen if I felt these feelings and I went through it and then still didn't give in? And then once you have, I guess, addressed the temptations, then they'll have less power. They won't be able to affect you as much because you'll see it for what it
Yeah.
is. And that's another thing that I heard about when trying to quit addictions is don't judge yourself. Stay innocently curious. And by doing that, when let's say you're trying to quit smoking cigarettes, you examine how do I feel when I smoke this? How does it taste? How does it smell? What do I like about it? And you don't judge yourself, but you just ask yourself these questions and you start to figure out, wow, it smells bad and I don't really like it. And it really
Yeah.
doesn't do a whole lot for me. It's really just a habit that I've picked up socially or through, a long time ago when I was going through a lot more stress then, and I just haven't quit. But you'll start to notice that it's not as appealing as it seems, and that can help break the that attachments. Another thing that can be
Yeah.
helpful is breaking the associations. So if you smoke every time you get in a car or after a meal or after sex, then if you break those habits, then the neuroplasticity that we mentioned will have to go outside of the default mode network to make to break those connections.
Yeah, what we're talking about is indeed intellectualizing the thing, looking at this cognitively and logically versus from the subconscious. A lot of this I dealt with, like going through this idea of asking myself what was triggering my biting or what was triggering my OCD when I would go to bite on the inside of my mouth. I'd work back these patterns. Like I would notice how my tongue would be searching around in my mouth for a new place to bite, which is super horribly graphic and strange. And I would start to think like, what actually triggered me doing that? Oh, there was a thought behind that. There was something that I was worried about that came to triggering my muscle reflexes in my mouth to start doing this action. And so once I came to start addressing those subconscious sources, things started getting better for themselves as well. Now, this did take me many months to get over. Like this wasn't something that happened in like 3 weeks or even like a couple months. And and it was very deep. Like the feeling that this is like most of this was coming from the subconscious and instantly triggering a muscle reaction before it hit my conscious brain. That made me feel very well, like animalistic. It made me feel like I was not in control of myself, and that can be very disturbing. So it's good to know. It's good to note that you may feel very uncomfortable when you go to address these issues. That's something that they usually warn in introductory psychology clinician or clinics when you're with a patient is just like the risk that you could
Worth
face when you're going through.
going,
But of course, it's worth going through
worth
these
going
efforts.
to
Yeah.
for sure, because you can learn things about yourselves and about yourself that you may not have realized that you have nerves or wounds that people can touch on, and then you lash out at them, and you're like, why did I just react like that? When you usually might not react over something like that, but it touched on something, and that's a lot of the reason why people get offended. A lot of times, if somebody says you have blue hair, you're just going to be like, oh yeah, whatever. I don't care what you think. But if somebody says, oh, that doesn't seem very intelligent, what you just did right there. That can bring up feelings like, oh, maybe I'm not intelligent, or how did they know? How do they know that I'm
Yeah.
not intelligent?
Yeah,
And then
that
it
hits me
touches on
hard.
wounds, and you lash out in a self-defense to try to preserve your um, ego and your self-image.
Or
When
you
if
just
you can
absorb it,
remember
like it can make you feel even more stupid, which
that
was the case
too.
for me. Like I ran with that for years. People just, I would even
Yeah, because
interpret
you
things like as being negative that weren't actually intended to be negative, but I'd still make it seem like it was something stupid that
yeah,
I
you
did.
buy in. You let them pull you into that belief rather than refusing to buy into that belief that isn't true. And that's the trap, is that if you buy into what people tell you or you put credence in it, then nothing anybody says is because of you. It's because of their issues. So we have no reason to get offended by what other people say when they're the ones who are feel the need to say it. That's not on us.
Yeah. Yeah, this is quite an upward spiral of improvement, ever onward and upward,
Yeah,
ever
it
onward and
says
upward.
that the upward spiral is you learn from each relapse. And
Yeah,
so, one of the things that my mom, people always admired in her is that no matter how many times she tried and quit and failed, she kept coming back and she kept trying and kept trying. And each time I'd like to think that she's learning something. Um, and the stretches of time where she can remain sober go longer and longer. But it's still when the triggers are so deep from childhood or from traumatic experiences, it's very hard to break free of those things that you've carried your entire life. It's like you
yeah,
can't
man.
escape. It's a shadow over you, and you can never be separated from it.
Totally. This is all very useful, man. I did want to look at the ecological systems theory as well before we close this thing out. I think that'll kind of like bring all this together. Um, so this dude Yuri Bronfenbrenner, back in the 40s, he proposed this idea of the ecological systems, or what he called the ecological systems theory. So that's recently been modified to the bioecological systems theory. So it includes our biology or our endogenous sources of influence that can affect how we or the disorders that we develop. So the one that we're looking at here is a more recent model that includes the chronos system, and that describes how all of these interacting factors change and are changed over time. So this, when I first saw this a few years ago, this was super useful to me. Um, the idea that we are we start out as a child and we're very malleable. We're very influenced by nature versus nurture. Or sorry, we're very influenced by nurture versus nature. Um, this is something that a lot of people flat out deny. Apparently, when I try to bring this up, this idea that yeah, you'd be surprised how many people actually don't agree that their environment affects them, or not at least at this level. But the more you look into this, like through anthropology, through social psychology, through all these fields, there's lots of convergence that gives a lot of credence to what we're seeing here. So at the very center of the diagram, you see the individual. This is you. This is who you are and who you
Your
are when you're born.
personality.
Your well, personality is specifically not listed in this because that can be manipulated over time. Indeed, your personality can change based on your environmental factors. That's one of the things that people like to straight up deny, like I was talking about
Well,
before.
that's the arrows that are pointing from the microsystem onto the individual, is that microsystem affects your personality, your home,
Yes.
school, neighborhood, immediate family.
So the part that this diagram for some reason is not labeling is at the center. There should be the bio part. There should be biological, and that includes all of your genetics, everything that sets you up to possibly have Down syndrome or possibly have like a genetic proclivity that would most lead to you developing bipolar disorder or whatever disorder there is. So that is your individual. That includes what gender you are. There is what age you are. Obviously, there's what genetic basis you have with your health. For me, I have Crohn's disease, and that is something that I inherited from my parents and their parents, and that may not have had developed that may not have developed to the severity that it's at now if I was in a different ecological system. If I had grown up in a different home, a more healthy, nurturing school structure, and all of the surrounding areas that we see around this.
It certainly could have been worse if you weren't able to get medical help. You'd just be suffering even more.
So in the yeah, and it's important to recognize that we're affected by all these factors here. I mean the way that this is laid out is really helpful to me. Like the fact that it's in these close circles. The closest circle that surrounds you is the most immediate things that affect you in your childhood development and also afterwards. Your family, your health services, if you have any church affiliations, or any clubs that you belong to, neighborhood play areas, or anything like that. and your peers, your friend groups, and your school.
I would even call this spheres of influence. So the things that affect who you are and your personality, and your interaction with these will determine how you turn out and how you adapt your belief systems and your behavioral habits.
Your
I mean,
indoctrinations.
everything. And it's really hard to break free if you don't have a positive microsystem. If your immediate family and neighborhood and school and home life are, not beneficial, they're maladaptive, then it's really hard to break free, as we know with the disadvantaged and disenfranchised peoples that are come to this country and they're left in poverty, and how it's very difficult to break free and to not let it affect you, to not let the violence and the poverty to seep in and affect your personality and lead to resentments. I mean, it's perfectly understandable why people would be frustrated and angry when their family is suffering and the government isn't helping them. That's why I
Yeah.
think that it's very important for the government to offer assistance for people who didn't choose this life and may not have the
Yeah.
resources to break out of it.
Now that's interesting you bring that up because that government structure is not listed in this most close inner circle. That's on the next circle, the exosystem, which interacts
Oh,
with the
wait, should we
microsystem.
talk
But
about, so what's the difference between the micro and the meso?
well, okay, so the mesosystem is the nuanced space in between the exosystem and the microsystem, where all of these are mixing factors, and that's why there's nothing there because that is a system that can be examined itself, but there's nothing there to examine. It's just the interaction between the exosystem and the microsystem. These are very interacting categories here. I mean, your the idea of your neighbors, like that's something that seems to just be disappearing now. Like we just completely disregard our neighbors, whereas like a few decades ago you would be sure to know who your next door neighbors were. You'd be sure to know that if I have to step out of town, I'm going to be able to call my neighbor to make sure that if something happens on my porch, then they're going to be able to take care of it, or
But
whatever
now
the
there's so
example
much
is.
separation. Everyone's so, isolated in their own lives that the the community is becoming less and less involved, sadly.
Yeah, it's really strange, but I mean that's only going to change if we talk about it more, and I think that's what we're doing here. So yeah, I'll just sum this up. The it shows on the outside is the macro system, and that is your attitudes and ideologies of the culture mixing with the overall attitudes and ideologies of the culture that affect you, that affect your friends and your family, that affect your neighbors and mass media and the government's policies about your environment, and all that trickles down to affecting your family and the health services that are provided by the government, church and club ideologies, your peer groups, and your school. So all of this, when you consider all of this, it really shows you how very much you are influenced by your environment, by your ecological system. And of course at the bottom this it shows the chronos system, like how this changes chronologically. These things shift over time. Like we were just saying, the concept of neighbors has radically changed just in the last couple of decades, largely thanks to the internet, in my opinion, and convenience and political divisiveness and separation and polarization. Yeah, so keeping these things in mind, just it's very useful. Like it's clearly it can show just how much we're affected by these things, and
Yeah, I think it's
you know,
important to identify how much we let things affect us, how much of an impact and we are getting from things, and also how much energy we're putting into the things that affect us.
yeah, man. Well, this has been a really useful discussion, man. I always appreciate talking to you. This is awesome as always. This I'm gonna use this word again. It's namaste. This means the light in me sees and respects the light in you. The incredible microcosms in me recognizes the incredible cellular structure and microcosms in you, and I can't not but respect that to the greatest of my ability. So namaste, my friend. I'll talk to you next time.
Namaste.